All right, everyone, welcome back. We have Doug Houston joining us from Sacramento. Doug has worked with Corp and Outdoor Industry Association for a long time, over 3 years, and has been a huge asset to our team and our advocacy efforts in the state. And so we're going to turn it over to Doug. I'll just kind of give you a brief intro to Doug. We talked a lot about Proposition 68. Doug and his colleagues were at Houston Magnani were lead lobbyists in drafting that piece of legislation. Doug's clients include Outdoor Industry Association, California Outdoor Recreation Partnership, California Parks and Recreation Society, County of Los Angeles, County of Sonoma, East Bay Regional Park District, Placer County, River and Mountains Conservancy, and Sierra Business Council, who we had Brittany on on our formal panel. Again, he's been on the Governor's Task Force, Park Commissioner. He's also a competitive cyclist, so he brings that experience with him into our work. And he really helped build Corp and our advocacy platform, so I appreciate his leadership on that. And then, as well as we've talked about the establishment of the Office of Outdoor Recreation, he was leading our efforts in the state on that. So with that, Doug, we'll pass it over to you.
Very good. Really quick, Katie. So on that particular slide, if you can go back to that slide real quick, it said created fictitious entity Corp in 2012. And I think it's important to note that because there's been so much discussion about the human side of investments in resources and conservation, I formed this not knowing where it was going to go way back in 2012 because the outdoors really didn't have a voice. There was a lot of time, money, and investment in conservation. Organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Land were spending lots of money on advocacy around habitat, around conservation. And there wasn't much discussion around the human side of it. So that was sort of the impetus way back in 2012, which really we were able to build the concept out in 2017, and we're moving forward. So very good. Let's proceed. Next slide. Katie, Lexi. So real quick, if I can, rather than just diving straight into the legislation, because I'm going to be Captain Redundant today. You know, a lot of folks touched on a lot of the bills, a lot of the concepts and constructs that I'm going to touch on during my presentation. So let me give you a little bit of backdrop so you understand some of the challenges going into this legislative year. So January budget was celebrated. It was received with tremendous hope and enthusiasm, roundly by conservation groups, Corp, and others. California was enjoying a $6 billion surplus. The state was sitting on a $20 billion rainy day fund. And given the largest of revenues that we have in the state, we saw very proactive steps that were taken by the administration in the January budget to see fit to ensure that investments in conservation and the outdoors and access move forward. Investments in nature education programming, as Jamie Go had mentioned in a previous panel discussion. There was new funding for state parks, operations, and deferred maintenance. There was $20 million set aside for the creation of a new state park. But come March, when we learned about this global pandemic, the revenue picture really came pretty bleak, and it became sort of like a Dickens-like tale of two cities. Required a lot of rethinking about what to do with existing revenues. The notion of a rainy day fund was going to be evaporate overnight. So all this new and unfortunately pessimistic thinking sort of filtered its way into the May revise. And all of those nice carrots that were thrown out to the conservation community during January were nixed from the May revise. Fortunately, we had a very resolute legislature that stood fast and made sure that a lot of these investments were secured, including money for nature education. There was a program called the Habitat Conservation Fund. It's an annual grant program. They're going to shift the money to biodiversity and away from the program. Money was retained for state parks and for a new state park, but however, the most significant casualty in the May revise, of course, was the governor's proposal for a climate bond, and that never seemed to get its proper footing after the May revise had excluded it. Although, you know, Assemblymember Friedman and Eduardo Garcia fought valiantly, unfortunately, the clock just sort of ran out on that particular piece of legislation. So we're looking toward 2021 and 2022 to revive that effort. But in the meantime, so legislation that Corp was following, monitoring this year was AB 3030. Assemblymember Ash Kalra gave you a very detailed analysis of the bill, its contents, its prospects moving forward. It is a stepping stone for meeting some objectives that have been outlined in the global deal of 50%. Of course, this bill calls on 30% protections for land, water, and oceans. And it supports regional, national, international efforts on this front. Importantly, it doubles down on the notion of balancing access with enhanced biodiversity and investments in biodiversity in the wake of climate change. So significant piece of legislation sort of puts a marker out there about where California is and where California wants to be moving forward, and we hope that it will be reintroduced. It sounds as though it will be next year, and that that Corp will be front and center in leading the advocacy charge on that particular piece of legislation. Next slide. So in as much as the governor had proposed in his own budget back in January at least $5 billion for a climate resources bond, a couple legislators took that cue, Senator Allen and Stern on the Assembly in SB 45, and then on the in the Senate, I'm sorry, and on the Assembly side, Eduardo Garcia formed a coalition of members up and down the state to begin, that were tasked on working on a climate resources bond that was reflective of priorities throughout the Democratic caucus. And I think it's really important to note, and this is just my preliminary analysis of the final version of language that I saw relative to this bill, but over $1 billion was going to be available for investments in access and the outdoors. Funding such as $100 million parks and recreation. There was $350 million for local regional park agencies to address climate and access issues, $300 million for self-help investments in local communities. Those are investments that local taxes that have been approved for climate and for resources purposes, $550 million for conservancies, $100 million for the Conservation Corps, and then $25 million in what are called innovative investment grants. And I put in parentheses GRT. Probably folks don't know what that means, what that acronym is, or but it is the Great Redwood Trail. There is some discussion about trying to link San Rafael to all the way to Eureka, a 300-mile linear trail along an abandoned railroad corridor, and this would be a good down payment on trying to make that happen. So lots of other really good content in the bill, things that are called risk reduction buffers, which are sort of durable shaded fuel breaks around vulnerable communities that have co-benefits like trail connectivity and enhancements. And it should be noted, again, going back to the human side of the equation, this bond, very front and center, early in the language, make sure that any of these investments related to the outdoors and related to climate, maintain some and retain some co-benefits. And that could be access, could be trail development, for example, could be parks or green space. So the authors were very forward thinking. Access is very front and center on this bond, and I'm certain it will be in future efforts as well. And then finally, our last piece of legislation. So 1296, Pathways to Green Employment. So the way I can describe it, this is sort of an intersection of emerging policy trends in California, trends like workforce development, and utilizing and shared goals around equity, employing youth, and particularly in disadvantaged communities, and again, developing them through workforce training for green employment and green jobs. And some of the priorities through the projects and would be for projects in fire-prone areas, projects to implement local plans around conservation, projects that leverage other funding, projects in urban settings, in greenways, riverways in particular. It's a good piece of legislation, and it required Natural Resources Agency and all the conservancies, including the Wildlife Conservation Board, to develop their own individual grant programs and do so in working in with conjunction with local nonprofits to deploy resources and human resources for these types of projects moving forward. Very smart piece of legislation, again, sort of a casualty of the times over in the building. So the last slide. So again, I think, you know, it had been mentioned time and time again through several speakers today that no one has given up on the notion of a climate bond. We have a really nice template in AB 32 and 45 on the Senate side moving forward. We had a very robust coalition building effort to try to advance these bonds. You might have heard there was an 11th hour effort to advance pieces of the previous bills that I just described in what is AB 1659, a $3 billion fire prevention and wildfire corridor protection sort of piece of legislation. Unfortunately, everybody was embracing of the policy objectives and the goals of that piece of legislation, but the funding mechanism didn't resonate with a number of legislators over there. And so sadly, the clock ran out on that particular legislation, as it wasn't really introduced until, probably 72 hours before the close of session. And Secretary Crowfoot and others had mentioned today Great American Outdoors Act and the new and more robust and annualized funding that will become available to California through the Land and Water Conservation Fund. One thing that I've been working on for the last couple years and want to continue to work on moving forward, and there seems to be an appetite for doing this, but back in 2012, I sat on the Governor Brown's Active Transportation Task Force. And in moving forward with an active transportation program, they took some non-motorized funding for recreation trails to serve for active transportation purposes. ATP has been fully funded, and it received more funding through SB 1. What I'd like to do is, and I'd like to have, you know, Corp's help in doing this next year, is to claw back some of the money for the Rec Trails program. It's only about $4 million a year. It would be a nice complement to what we're trying to do with land and water conservation going forward. So that will be part of my efforts. And then ongoing COVID response to recreation. I'm not quite sure how to respond to that moving forward. It has been noted and mentioned many times, and I've been witness to it. We're positioned pretty nicely moving forward in terms of investments and reinvestments in resources, the outdoors and access to the outdoors. We're seeing spikes in visitation. We're seeing spikes in recreational sales up and down the state. I think importantly, our response will be to support any investments that this administration wants to make in the outdoors, and perhaps make some suggested investments in the outdoors moving forward, investments in the context of a bond, programmatic funding that might be available if there's any added revenue or additional revenues in this year's budget. So with that, I guess I turn this back over to Katie or Lexi or Matt, moving into our breakout sessions for lobbying.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Doug, stop video. All right, everyone, it's been a really productive, inspiring, and I think thoughtful day of discussions. And we appreciate everyone. There's still a lot of people participating, and we're going to jump platforms here. We're going to go into talking about the purpose of lobby visits. And so I encourage all of you to join us on our Zoom meeting link that you have received from us. And really, we're going to be sharing tips and, points of engagement that you can take this back into your local communities or to your state legislators. And we have breakout sessions. You'll have a lobby lead who will kind of help you through those discussions. But it's a great opportunity to practice your script and what that might look like, as well as another opportunity to network with folks. I think a huge part of our success over the last 2 years of holding these was getting together and really elevating our voices, the outdoor recreation community in California. We're doing that virtually. And again, just like how everyone said, there will be a time for us to come back and re-engage with these folks and legislators and, have another advocacy day, lobby day, whatever that might look like in Sacramento. So if you have the time, I just encourage you guys to join us. And then with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt Lyon, the chair of CORP, to give us his closing remarks. And I hope to see you guys over at the Zoom meeting. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Katie. So this will be the wrap up of the webinar portion, and then, as Katie was saying, hopefully we'll see as many people as want to come over on the meeting portion after this. So this has been a great day. So many faces, so many familiar faces, so many new faces. I have to say, in the last 6 months, not being up in Sacramento or around this group, I see a lot of folks that would love to get back in the trenches and push for these things, our issues again. I really want to thank everyone. First of all, our organizers, so Lexi Grittelfeld with CORP and Katie Hawkins with OA. Fantastic work, you two. Very well done. And thanks to Tracy Verado Torres for supporting them in this effort. Our co-host, OIA with Lisa Angenberg and Outdoor Alliance with Adam Kramer. Thank you so much for contributing to this and for our activities together here in California. Just a shout out to CORP's main members, our grant sponsors, the North Face and REI. Thank you for your continued support, and to all of our members, 60 plus members out there. Yes, it's a tough year this year, but we still value all your membership and want to keep our numbers strong and growing as we go into the future. And then just for the people who provided their staff and for speakers and panelists today, Resource Legacy Foundation, Sierra Business Council, Doug Houston with Houston Magnani, and Tracy with TVT Consulting, Priority Strategies, Outdoor Outreach, and the Avarna Group, and to our sponsors of our morning coffee and the happy hour, Wild Barn Coffee and Supperfest. Thank you to everyone. And, in the words of Wade Crowfoot from this morning, be bold. Think about joining our groups. That is the number one thing you can do to move our issues forward today. Corp, CaliforniaOutdoor.org, Outdoor Industry Alliance, or if you're an enthusiast, Outdoor Alliance. We all would love your membership. And then as these things as these issues come up and we ask for outreach and support, be ready to do your thing. That's how we're going to make a difference going forward. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully we'll see you over at the Zoom meetings in a few minutes.